She didn't wash it, she wore it. That was the first sentence Max spoke to the crowd after 7 years of complete silence. A simple phrase, yet it rendered the entire hall speechless. Before the BOY lay an old apron, splattered with paint, the very first canvas a waitress had ever handed to Max. No one believed a child who couldn't speak could convey so much through a single gesture, but the BOY had painted, and that woman didn't wipe away the stains, didn't hide them. She wore them as a symbol. This isn't a story about art. This is a story about permission and the miracle that happens when someone dares to let a child soil their world and chooses to keep those stains as something sacred. Morning in 5 Points begins with the wind gently brushing against the canopy of trees lining the narrow street. The first rays of sunlight slip through the thick glass of Hollow and Harvest Cafe, scattering across the dark wooden tables in faint streaks like fragments of memory someone has accidentally left behind. In that space, the aroma of fresh espresso mingles slowly with nutmeg in the air, as if time here always moves a few heartbeats more slowly than the rest of the city. The door opens softly. Caleb Monroe steps inside, his left hand clasping a tiny, cold one. He is dressed simply, wearing a navy sweater that covers his neck, yet his posture still carries the polish of someone accustomed to emerging from hundreds of important meetings. Today, however, his gaze has no schedule, no strategy, only watchfulness, quiet, yet resolute. Beside him is Max, 7 years old, smaller than that stature might allow, and quieter than anything a child ought to carry. The boy looks at no one, and at nothing. His long hair falls over part of his face, like a curtain between him and the unbearable world. Every movement seems tethered by an invisible thread, slow, hesitant, and lacking warmth. Max was diagnosed with sensory processing disorder at age 3. But Caleb needed no doctor to tell him something had prevented his son from connecting with this life. Max has never spoken, not because he didn't want to, but because, in his world, perhaps language was unnecessary. Caleb had grown accustomed to that silence. In part, he accepted it as one lives with a scar, never touching it, never wishing it gone, simply learning to wear clothing that covers it each day. He loves his son by controlling everything around the BOY. Schedules, meals, sounds, light, every melody played in the car. Each element is a protective barrier, though deep down, he knows there are things no fence can hold back. They sit at a table by the window, a familiar spot. Not too close to the counter, not too close to people. Caleb places Max's small backpack on the adjacent chair. The BOY sits motionless, eyes unfocused. 1 minute, then another. He intends to pull out his phone, as he does every morning. But today, something gives him pause. Max is staring. Not at him, nor at the sunlight. At a small watercolor palette, carelessly set on the next table. A few wet brushes, green and red smudges still clinging to the paper liner. Perhaps some other child left it behind as a toy. But Max was never accidental. He observes it as though before him lies something more significant than a plaything, a language he once knew, then had ripped from his hands too soon. His fingers curl, trembling, then slowly unfold. They don't touch, don't reach. They hover in midair, as if afraid that a single further inch and everything would vanish. Caleb watches from across. His heart skips a beat. Part of him wants to speak. Another part fears to shatter this fragile moment like a bubble bursting too early in the sunlight. Across the room, a waitress is wiping down a table. The young woman with the soft curls and an apron stained with old coffee spots slows when she catches sight of Max. Her eyes are still as a pond, yet her gaze is unusually penetrating. She sees, truly sees what others merely glance past. She stops, speaks no word. intrudes not, merely observes. Something has begun to move, silently, without sound, yet so unmistakable it steals your breath. Have you ever witnessed a look that sets the entire world inside you trembling?
Welcome to 30 Millionaire Stories, where success meets solitude, and every story heals a hidden wound. Subscribe and discover the heart behind the fortune.
June Calhoun had worked enough morning and afternoon shifts at Hollow and Harvest to know its rhythm like the back of her hand. She knew which table would wobble if a customer leaned on it, knew the old espresso machine would change its tone around 8:15 a.m., and knew exactly which faces were regulars and which were just here for a one-time visit. Though she was a part-time server, she was also an art teacher at the nearby community center, and she had a special relationship with chaos. She didn't avoid it like most adults, rather. She observed it, listened to it, and often let it unfold naturally. That morning, as June was wiping down a table, her gaze happened to flicker to table number 4, the small one by the window. A man in a dark navy sweater, impeccably put together, was bent over his phone. Beside him sat a BOY, thin, quiet. Something in the way the BOY sat made June pause mid-wipe. That little one didn't fidget like other kids, didn't touch anything, but there was a barely perceptible movement, a slight nod of his gaze. And June followed it to the watercolor tray perched on the next table. It was an old tray. The paint was still wet. Perhaps another child had painted something and then left. No one paid it any mind, except that BOY, Max. June didn't know his name then, but she felt one thing. Those eyes weren't looking at color, they were looking through color, as if beneath the paint lay something unspoken. His finger lifted slightly, suspended in midair. Didn't touch, didn't tremble. Unclear whether he wanted to or if it was mere reflex. Most servers would have cleared that tray away. Customers rarely liked kids making a mess, let alone ruining tables and chairs. But June was different. Without a sound, without a warning, she walked slowly to the table, met those eyes that didn't look at her, then gently removed her apron. That cotton cloth had accompanied her through hundreds of mornings, stained with coffee, blueberry jam, and the faint traces of years gone by. She laid it in front of Max, no explanation. Just a single phrase, soft as a breath. Today, this is your canvas. No demands, no instructions, no pressure. A silence stretched. Max stared at the fabric as if it weren't fabric but a door, and he had never dared to touch its handle. But this time his hand moved. Slowly, very slowly. The brush tip touched the blue paint. He dipped it lightly, lifted it. A droplet of paint fell onto the cloth, spreading like a tiny cloud. No one spoke. No one laughed. Max studied that spot of color as if checking whether it was real, then bent down again, dipped again, this time green, then yellow, then red. Each time the brush met cloth, the fabric trembled ever so slightly, like breathing, like living, like it had finally become itself, not a uniform, but an extension of someone striving to find a way out. Caleb looked up from his phone. He meant to check the meeting time. Instead, he saw his son's hand moving. The BOY was painting. No one guided him. No one asked. No suggestion. He simply painted. He closed his phone and set it on the table. His eyes never left the spreading streaks of color on the waitress's apron. It was a sight he'd never witnessed, neither in therapy nor in class, nor at home. For the first time, Massachusetts X had stepped out of his silent world. Not with words, not with gestures, but with color. And the woman standing quietly, no photos, no fanfare, no calls for help, just stood, hands clasped behind her back, watching every motion as if it were the most sacred thing she'd ever seen. Do you believe that sometimes the first thing a child needs isn't advice, but simply a canvas big enough to embrace their mess? My dear audience, stay tuned for the next part that will leave you awestruck. Take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment below to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always exciting to see viewers joining us from around the world. The cafe had emptied out after the lunchtime rush. The porcelain cups had been gathered, tabletops wiped clean, and the floor was beginning to reclaim its quiet composure. The late-day light sliced through the paned windows, stretching silhouettes into blurred streaks across the wood. Caleb rose from the table, leaving his cup behind as he always did. His polished leather shoes tapped softly on the floor as he approached the service counter. His eyes, ordinarily a testament to focus and strategy, held something else today. Something even he could not yet name. Behind the counter, June was stacking glasses. She didn't notice his footsteps until he was standing before her. No greeting, no smile. He spoke bluntly, his voice low but icy. "Did you let the boy paint on my apron?" June looked up, unflustered, her head unmoved. She met his gaze, then slowly lowered her eyes to the apron she was wearing. The paint stains were still faintly visible across the front. A curve of green like a kite about to soar. A smear of red, like ripened blood, yet soft. She held her tongue. Caleb pressed on, his tone rough around the edges. What if those stains never come out? Silence hung between them. June raised a hand and lightly touched the fabric, not as one who cleans, but as one who cherishes. "That's exactly why," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "I let him do it." Caleb narrowed his eyes, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing, or as if no one had ever dared answer him that way before. "The boy is fragile," he said, leaning forward slightly as though to emphasize. "He doesn't need chaos. He needs rules, boundaries." June did not back down or interrupt. She waited until he finished, then calmly replied, "The boy doesn't need to be controlled like a system. He needs permission, like a human being." Her answer wasn't loud, but it dropped between them like a heavy weight. Caleb clenched his fist slightly, not in anger, but because something inside him had shifted a territory he had long kept locked. The authority of a man who always had the answer was suddenly challenged by the calm of a woman who needed no power to speak the truth. Without a word in response, he turned and walked away, leaving the service counter behind like an unwon battle. Yet something within him had unsettled. He couldn't understand why the sight of a waitress standing silently beside a dirty apron disturbed him so deeply. The next day, June was nowhere to be found behind the counter. No one explained. She was simply informed of a temporary adjustment to her schedule. Her shift would start later. Her station was now in the back kitchen, washing glasses, mopping floors, checking inventory. No serving customers, no weaving between tables, no apron. And no Max. The small room behind the cafe was cooler, quieter, and cleaner. But for June, it was colder not because of the air conditioning, but because of the absence of the BOY's gaze from the day before. That hovering, profound look like a sea's unfathomable depth that she had felt, even if only for an instant. The apron still hung on the hook behind the door, neatly folded, its paint streaks drying and hardening like a protective shell around a memory. June did not complain. She did not react. But as she washed each glass in the stainless steel sink, her hand would brush against the smear of paint clinging to the cuff of her sleeve. A part of her knew. She had been pushed aside for daring to let a child speak by not stopping him. So in a world that worships cleanliness and conformity, Is there room for love in the form of a stain no one dares to wash away? No one needed to tell Max that June was gone from the counter. There was no explanation, no farewell, but Max knew. Somehow, the BOY always sensed when something truly important had left his familiar space, as if he could hear the sound of a door that makes no noise, yet still creates an emptiness. The next morning, Caleb still brought him to the cafe. The same seat, the same slanted light through the window, but where someone once stood silently watching him paint, now there was only emptiness. The scene looked the same, but the feeling was gone. Max placed his hand on the tabletop, then withdrew it. His fingertips curled into his palm. The BOY did not look at the paint tray, nor at his father. His gaze sank, as if folding himself inward. Caleb scrolled his phone as usual, but from time to time glanced over at his son, waiting for a signal, something like yesterday. But Max did not paint. He did not lean down. He did not touch anything. His whole body shrank like a bud touched by an early frost. In subsequent therapy sessions, everything grew heavier. Max refused to hold a brush. When tools were placed in his hand, he dropped them. The colors that once made the BOY glow in silence now meant nothing. When encouraged to speak, he did not respond. When someone smiled gently, he did not smile back. Max curled up like a sheet of wet paper, unable to hold shape, unable to unfold. Caleb said nothing to the therapist, offered no explanation. Part of him suspected why, yet he kept denying it. Because if it were true, if the absence of one waitress could drag his son back into that invisible void, then every effort he'd made so far had been merely background. One late night, Caleb returned home after a long meeting. The hallway light was still on, but Max's room lay dark. He stepped quietly through the half-open door, intending only to check if his son was asleep. The room was not as usual. On the floor, paint boxes lay scattered. Paper was torn into small fragments, as if someone tried to rip apart something indescribable. Pencils were snapped in two. A watercolor tube had burst, leaving a purple smear across the carpet. The corner of the room was the only place untouched. And there, he saw it, a crumpled scrap of paper, torn on one side, yet still recognizably shaped. It was a sketch. Though incomplete, Caleb recognized it instantly. It was the apron. Not anyone else's, but June's, the dark, worn apron stained with paint that Max had touched, as if touching the first proof of his own existence. Beneath the drawing, in awkward, trembling handwriting, was a jagged note. She gave me permission to speak. Caleb sank down beside the paper, motionless. His heart felt as if someone had placed a block of steel upon his chest. There were no tears, but the silence within him felt like a scream drowned under water. A few days later, during a quiet therapy session, when everyone expected Max to lapse into silence again, he suddenly lifted his head. He looked at no one, did not frown, but his mouth parted. And as if time stopped, Massachusetts X spoke the first words he'd uttered in years. She agreed. 4 words. Soft, but enough to melt the ice encasing a father's heart. Caleb bowed his head. No one could see his face then, but his hand clenched, then opened, as if releasing something he'd held onto far too tightly. Perhaps, sometimes what keeps a child silent isn't the pain itself, but that they have never truly been heard. Dear audience, take a moment to relax or sip some water, then stay tuned for the rest of the story. More surprises await. Comment 1 if you enjoyed this tale, so we know you're still here. One late autumn afternoon, the Denver sky was draped in a thin gray veil, like an old silk covering the city. Wind swept through rows of red brick houses, rolling dry maple leaves along the sidewalk. Caleb stood before a small, unassuming building, its interior glowing warmly. A simple sign read, South Side Arts for Children. He read it twice, as if to ensure he was in the right place. Then he stepped inside. No one recognized him. Here there was no suit, no title, no deferential glances he was so accustomed to. Only the scratch of crayons on paper, the soft laughter of children, and the quiet patience of adults seated among them, as though every motion risks shattering something delicate. Caleb lingered at the doorway, careful not to disrupt. His eyes roamed until they settled. June sat on the floor with a group of children, each with a blank sheet of paper, a few primary colors, and a water tray. She neither directed much nor forced them. She merely asked questions, sometimes with words, sometimes with a look. The children responded with strokes that were clumsy but full of feeling. One child drew a house, another simply spread color. Another sketched a figure with ears as large as wings. June smiled when a little boy picked up a pencil and drew a purple sundae. She didn't correct him or insist he change the hue. She let the purple sun be born as it wished. Caleb didn't look away. He stood there throughout the session until the children trickled out one by one, some bidding her goodbye with hurried hugs, others with silent nods. June gathered her supplies, stacked the paper, and rinsed her brushes. Caleb approached but didn't speak immediately. When only the two of them remained, she looked up, not surprised, not stepping back, simply waiting for him to speak, as if she'd known he would arrive, sooner or later. "I thought I was protecting the boy," Caleb said, his voice hoarse and soft, stripped of the authority of a man who had led countless million-dollar projects. "But in truth, I was only protecting the version of him I wanted him to become." June said nothing. She simply met his gaze eyes deep enough not to overpower, calm enough to let him see himself fully. He exhaled, then pulled a neatly folded piece of paper from his breast pocket. The edges were slightly curled, evidence of being handled many times. He unfolded it and placed it on the table between them. It was a sketch. By Max. An apron sea blue blotches in the center, yellow at one corner, and red scored on like a final stroke of determination. Beneath, Max was scrawled in thick black ink, not perfectly aligned, but unmistakably the boy's own handwriting. The boy held on to this image, Caleb said, his eyes never leaving the drawing. "It's the only thing he never tore apart." June bent forward. Her finger traced the paper's edge lightly, leaving no mark, as though she feared smudging the memory in each line of ink. For the first time, Caleb looked at her not as a father burdened by preconceptions or as a man who believed himself always right, but as someone learning to set aside his ego and enter another's world. They didn't need many words. Everything that needed saying was in that scrap of paper, in the boy's silent gaze, and in the presence of a man brave enough to return and acknowledge what few dare to admit. Sometimes true love isn't about protecting, but about letting go. Outside, the rain began to fall softly. Tiny droplets tapped the window pane, mingling with the rustle of paper as June refolded the sketch and held it close, as if it were the most precious gift she could ever receive. Some apologies require no words. Only the right person to preserve the stain another would erase. Spring arrived in Denver as quietly as the first breath of day. The bare branches lining South Broadway began to droop with the season's first green shoots, as if marking something slowly healing bit by bit. Inside the newly opened community exhibition hall, everything still carried the scent of fresh paint and unseasoned wood. The high ceilings diffused light evenly across the room, and dominating that space were the children's aprons hung aloft like flags. Each one bore unique marks: smudged watercolor, gleaming glitter, impromptu cut and paste, scrawled handwriting clumsy, but filled with freedom. Beneath each apron was the name of a child, printed in large, clear, unedited typeface. No templates, no standards, no beautiful or ugly, only the truth. All of it was part of a newly unveiled initiative, the Permission Project, a nonprofit founded by Caleb Monroe and named for his son, Massachusetts 10. The project was not designed to cure disorders, but to create a sanctuary for children who don't fit the mold, a place where they need not strive to conform, but are permitted to exist fully as themselves. The opening ceremony was unembellished. No dramatic music, no lengthy speeches. Just a small stage, a few rows of chairs filled by parents, teachers, and those who had quietly supported children whom society often overlooks. Caleb stood at one corner of the stage. Unlike previous occasions, today, he held no script, no welcoming remarks, no program to lead. He simply remained silent, his hands clasped before him, not to hold in pressure, but as though trying to contain something fragile emerging. Not fear, but newfound faith. The audience hushed as the lights dimmed. From the wing, a BOY stepped onto the stage. Max. Still the soft hair framing his cheeks, still the simple ivory dress and tiny velvet shoes. But his gaze had changed, no longer hiding, nor seeking attention. It was the look of someone who has glimpsed something greater than themselves. His hands still trembled, the familiar tremor never gone. Yet each step he took onto the stage was surprisingly resolute. In his hand, Massachusetts X carried a length of silk ribbon tied to a red velvet curtain suspended center stage. The entire room held its breath. 1 beat, 2 beats. Then Max tugged the curtain. Behind it hung an apron. Not new, not pristine, not displayed in an ornate frame, simply draped on a rustic wooden hook, as though someone had just taken it off after a long day's work. But no one in the room could be mistaken. It was June's old apron. Still bearing the original paint streaks, the blue blotch at its center, yellow smears on one side, and red like a memory not yet dry. Still soft, still marked. Unwashed, unaltered, unedited. Max moved to the microphone at center stage. He did not look at the audience, only at the apron. Then he spoke, softly. Yet it carried to every corner of the hall. She didn't wash it, she wore it. That was all. But the room froze in that instant. A single breath held in every chest, not from surprise, but from understanding. They had all once tried to scrub the stains from their children's lives, or had been the child wearing those stains, hoping someone would see them without wiping them away. At the edge of the stage, June stood. She did not step forward. She did not speak, but her eyes glistened, as full as a pond near overflow in a heavy rain. She did not smile. She did not need to. Her whole being seemed to exhale more freely, as though an invisible tether had been loosened around her chest. Caleb did not look at anyone, but for the first time in years, his hands unclenched. He relaxed, let go, made no attempt to fix, made no attempt to control. In that moment, he was no longer the father of a special child. He was simply a father learning to love unconditionally, learning to bear the stains on his own shirt if it meant stepping into his child's world. There are paint stains that cannot be washed away and should not be, because sometimes what makes us imperfect is the very thing that makes us real. Sometimes what shames us, a smear of color, an impulsive act, a moment of vulnerability, is precisely what brings us closer together. The story of Max, Caleb, and June isn't just about a syndrome or therapy. It's about something far more fundamental, being granted the permission to be different. When a child is allowed to make a mess, to be imperfect, to exist without being corrected, they don't just learn to express themselves. They learn that they deserve to be seen. And sometimes, all they need is someone who refuses to wipe them clean. If this story has touched you, please leave a comment sharing your feelings. In your life, have you ever been Max, Caleb, or June? Hit like, share this video with someone who needs to hear this today. And don't forget to subscribe, because here, we believe the most beautiful stains are those no one tries to wash away. Thank you for staying with us until the end. You are not alone.